The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Miss Lydia Willis, at Gloucester. My dear Letty, this method of writing to you from time to time, without any hopes of an answer, affords me, I own, some ease and satisfaction in the midst of my disquiet, as it in some degree lightens the burthen of affliction, but it is at best a very imperfect enjoyment of friendship, because it admits of no return of confidence and good counsel. I would give the whole world to have your company for a single day. I am heartily tired of this itinerant way of life. I am quite dizzy with a perpetual succession of objects. Besides, it is impossible to travel such a length of way, without being exposed to inconveniencies, dangers, and disagreeable accidents, which prove very grievous to a poor creature of weak nerves like me, and make me pay very dear for the gratification of my curiosity. Nature never intended me for the busy world. I long for repose and solitude, where I can enjoy that disinterested friendship which is not to be found among crowds, and indulge those pleasing reveries that shun the hurry and tumult of fashionable society. Unexperienced as I am in the commerce of life, I have seen enough to give me a disgust to the generality of those who carry it on. There is such malice, treachery, and dissimulation, even among professed friends and intimate companions, as cannot fail to strike a virtuous mind with horror, and when vice quits the stage for a moment, her place is immediately occupied by folly, which is often too serious to excite anything but compassion. Perhaps I ought to be silent on the foibles of my poor aunt, but, with you, my dear Willis, I have no secrets, and, truly, her weaknesses are such as cannot be concealed. Since the first moment we arrived at Bath, she has been employed constantly in spreading nets for the other sex, and, at length, she has caught a superannuated lieutenant, who is in a fair way to make her change her name. My uncle and my brother seem to have no objection to this extraordinary match, which, I make no doubt, will afford abundance of matter for conversation and mirth. For my part, I am too sensible of my own weaknesses, to be diverted with those of other people. At present, I have something at heart that employs my whole attention, and keeps my mind in the utmost terror and suspense. Yesterday in the forenoon, as I stood with my brother at the parlor window of an inn, where we had lodged, a person passed a horseback, whom, gracious heaven, I instantly discovered to be Wilson. He wore a white riding coat, with the cape buttoned up to his chin, looking remarkably pale, and passed at a round trot, without seeming to observe us. Indeed, he could not see us, for there was a blind that concealed us from the view. You may guess how I was affected at this apparition. The light forsook my eyes, and I was seized with such a palpitation and trembling, that I could not stand. I sat down upon a couch, and strove to compose myself, that my brother might not perceive my agitation, but it was impossible to escape his prying eyes. He had observed the object that alarmed me, and, doubtless, knew him at the first glance. He now looked at me with a stern countenance, then, he ran out into the street, to see what road the unfortunate horseman had taken. He afterwards dispatched his man for further intelligence, and seemed to meditate some violent design. My uncle, being out of order, we remained another night at the inn, and all day long Jery acted the part of an indefatigable spy upon my conduct. He watched my very looks with such eagerness of attention, as if he would have penetrated into the utmost recesses of my heart. This may be owing to his regard for my honor, if it is not the effect of his own pride, but he is so hot, and violent, and unrelenting, that the sight of him alone throws me into a flutter, and really it will not be in my power to afford him any share of my affection, if he persists in persecuting me at this rate. I am afraid he has formed some scheme of vengeance, which will make me completely wretched. I am afraid he suspects some collusion from this appearance of Wilson. Good God! Did he really appear? Or was it only a phantom, a pale spectre to apprise me of his death? Oh Letty, what shall I do? Where shall I turn for advice and consolation? Shall I implore the protection of my uncle, who has been always kind and compassionate? This must be my last resource. I dread the thoughts of making him uneasy, and would rather suffer 1,000 deaths than live the cause of dissension in the family. I cannot conceive the meaning of Wilson's coming hither. Perhaps it was in quest of us, in order to disclose his real name and situation, but wherefore pass without staying to make the least inquiry? My dear Willis, I am lost in conjecture. I have not closed an eye since I saw him. All night long have I been tossed about from one imagination to another. The reflection finds no resting place. I have prayed, and sighed, and wept plentifully. If this terrible suspense continues much longer, I shall have another fit of illness, and then the whole family will be in confusion. If it was consistent with the wise purposes of Providence, would I were in my grave, but it is my duty to be resigned. My dearest Letty, excuse my weakness, excuse these blots. My tears fall so fast that I cannot keep the paper dry, yet I ought to consider that I have as yet no cause to despair, but I am such a faint-hearted timorous creature. Thank God, my uncle is much better than he was yesterday. He is resolved to pursue our journey, straight to Wales. I hope we shall take Gloucester in our way, that hope cheers my poor heart. I shall once more embrace my best beloved Willis, and pour all my griefs into her friendly bosom. Heaven. Is it possible that such happiness is reserved for the dejected and forlorn Lydia Melford? October. To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. Of Jesus College, Uxon. Dear Watkin, I yesterday met with an incident which I believe you will own to be very surprising. As I stood with Liddy at the window of the inn where we had lodged, who should pass by but Wilson a horseback! I could not be mistaken in the person, for I had a full view of him as he advanced. I plainly perceived by my sister's confusion that she recognized him at the same time. I was equally astonished and incensed at his appearance, which I could not but interpret into an insult, or something worse. I ran out at the gate, and, seeing him turn the corner of the street, I dispatched my servant to observe his motions, but the fellow was too late to bring me that satisfaction. He told me, however, that there was an inn, called the Red Lion, at that end of the town, where he supposed the horseman had alighted, but that he would not inquire without further orders. I sent him back immediately to know what strangers were in the house, and he returned with a report that there was one Mr. Wilson lately arrived. In consequence of this information I charged him with a note directed to that gentleman, desiring him to meet me in half an hour in a certain field at the town's end, with a case of pistols, in order to decide the difference which could not be determined at our last rencounter, but I did not think proper to subscribe the billet. My man assured me he had delivered it into his own hand, and, that having read it, he declared he would wait upon the gentleman at the place and time appointed. Mulpine being an old soldier, and, luckily sober at the time, I entrusted him with my secret. I ordered him to be within call, and, having given him a letter to be delivered to my uncle in case of accident, I repaired to the rendezvous, which was an enclosed field at a little distance from the highway. I found my antagonist had already taken his ground, wrapped in a dark horseman's coat, with a laced hat flapped over his eyes, but, what was my astonishment, when, throwing off this wrapper, he appeared to be a person whom I had never seen before. He had one pistol stuck in a leather belt, and another in his hand ready for action, and, advancing a few steps, called to know if I was ready. I answered, no, and desired a parley, upon which he turned the muzzle of his piece towards the earth, then replaced it in his belt, and met me halfway. When I assured him he was not the man I expected to meet, he said it might be so, that he had received a slip of paper directed to Mr. Wilson, requesting him to come hither, and that as there was no other in the place of that name, he naturally concluded the note was intended for him, and him only. I then gave him to understand that I had been injured by a person who assumed that name, which person I had actually seen within the hour, passing through the street on horseback. That hearing there was a Mr. Wilson at the Red Lion, I took it for granted he was the man, and in that belief had writ the billet, and I expressed my surprise, that he, who was a stranger to me and my concerns, should give me such a rendezvous, without taking the trouble to demand a previous explanation. He replied that there was no other of his name in the whole country, that no such horseman had alighted at the Red Lion since 9 o'clock, when he arrived, that having had the honor to serve his Majesty, he thought he could not decently decline any invitation of this kind, from what quarter soever it might come, and that if any explanation was necessary, it did not belong to him to demand it, but to the gentleman who summoned him into the field. Vexed as I was at this adventure, I could not help admiring the coolness of this officer, whose open countenance prepossessed me in his favor. He seemed to be turned of 40, wore his own short black hair, which curled naturally about his ears, and was very plain in his apparel. When I begged pardon for the trouble I had given him, he received my apology with great good humor. He told me that he lived about 10 miles off, at a small farmhouse, which would afford me tolerable lodging, if I would come and take diversion of hunting with him for a few weeks, in which case we might, perhaps, find out the man who had given me offense. I thanked him very sincerely for his courteous offer, which, I told him, I was not at liberty to accept at present, on account of my being engaged in a family party, and so we parted, with mutual professions of goodwill and esteem. Now tell me, dear knight, what am I to make of this singular adventure? Am I to suppose that the horseman I saw was really a thing of flesh and blood, or a bubble that vanished into air? Or must I imagine Liddy knows more of the matter than she chooses to disclose? If I thought her capable of carrying on any clandestine correspondence with such a fellow, I should at once discard all tenderness, and forget that she was connected with me by the ties of blood. But how is it possible that a girl of her simplicity and inexperience should maintain such an intercourse, surrounded, as she is, with so many eyes, destitute of all opportunity, and shifting quarters every day of her life? Besides, she has solemnly promised. No, I can't think the girl so base, so insensible to the honor of her family. What disturbs me chiefly is the impression which these occurrences seem to make upon her spirits. These are the symptoms from which I conclude that the rascal has still a hold on her affection. Surely I have a right to call him a rascal, and to conclude that his designs are infamous. But it shall be my fault if he does not one day repent his presumption. I confess I cannot think, much less write on this subject, with any degree of temper or patience. I shall therefore conclude with telling you that we hope to be in Wales by the latter end of the month, but before that period you will probably hear again from your affectionate J. Melford. October. To Sir Watkin Phillips, Bart. Of Jesus College, Uxon. Dear Phillips, when I wrote you by last post, I did not imagine I should be tempted to trouble you again so soon, but I now sit down with a heart so full that it cannot contain itself, though I am under such agitation of spirits, that you are to expect neither method nor connection in this address. We have been this day within a hair's breadth of losing honest Matthew Bramble, in consequence of a cursed accident, which I will endeavor to explain. In crossing the country to get into the post road, it was necessary to ford a river, and we that were a horseback passed without any danger or difficulty, but a great quantity of rain having fallen last night and this morning, there was such an accumulation of water, that a mill head gave way, just as the coach was passing under it, and the flood rushed down with such impetuosity, as first floated, and then fairly overturned the carriage in the middle of the stream. Lismahago and I, and the 2 servants, alighting instantaneously, ran into the river to give all the assistance in our power. Our aunt, Mrs. Tabitha, who had the good fortune to be uppermost, was already halfway out of the coach window, when her lover approaching, disengaged her entirely, but, whether his foot slipped, or the burthen was too great, they fell over head and ears in each other's arms. He endeavored more than once to get up, and even to disentangle himself from her embrace, but she hung about his neck like a millstone, no bad emblem of matrimony, and if my man had not proved a staunch auxiliary, those 2 lovers would in all probability have gone hand in hand to the shades below. For my part, I was too much engaged to take any cognizance of their distress. I snatched out my sister by the hair of the head, and, dragging her to the bank, recollected that my uncle had, not yet appeared. Rushing again into the stream, I met Clinker hauling ashore Mrs. Jenkins, who looked like a mermaid with her hair dishevelled about her ears, but, when I asked if his master was safe, he forthwith shook her from him, and she must have gone to pot, if a miller had not seasonably come to her relief. As for Humphrey, he flew like lightning to the coach, that was by this time filled with water, and, diving into it, brought up the poor squire, to all appearance, deprived of life. It is not in my power to describe what I felt at this melancholy spectacle. It was such an agony as baffles all description. The faithful Clinker, taking him up in his arms, as if he had been an infant of 6 months, carried him ashore, howling most piteously all the way, and I followed him in a transport of grief and consternation. When he was laid upon the grass and turned from side to side, a great quantity of water ran out at his mouth, then he opened his eyes, and fetched a deep sigh. Clinker, perceiving these signs of life, immediately tied up his arm with a garter, and, pulling out a horse fleam, let him blood in the farrier style. At first a few drops only issued from the orifice, but the limb being chafed, in a little time the blood began to flow in a continued stream, and he uttered some incoherent words, which were the most welcome sounds that ever saluted my ear. There was a country inn hard by, the landlord of which had by this time come with his people to give their assistance. Thither my uncle, being carried, was undressed and put to bed, wrapped in warm blankets, but having been moved too soon, he fainted away, and once more lay without sense or motion, notwithstanding all the efforts of Clinker and the landlord, who bathed his temples with Hungary water, and held a smelling bottle to his nose. As I had heard of the efficacy of salt in such cases, I ordered all that was in the house to be laid under his head and body, and whether this application had the desired effect, or nature of herself prevailed, he, in less than a quarter of an hour, began to breathe regularly, and soon retrieved his recollection, to the unspeakable joy of all the bystanders. As for Clinker, his brain seemed to be affected. He laughed, and wept, and danced about in such a distracted manner, that the landlord very judiciously conveyed him out of the room. My uncle, seeing me dropping wet, comprehended the whole of what had happened, and asked if all the company was safe. Being answered in the affirmative, he insisted upon my putting on dry clothes, and, having swallowed a little warm wine, desired he might be left to his repose. Before I went to shift myself, I inquired about the rest of the family. I found Mrs. Tabitha still delirious from her fright, discharging very copiously the water she had swallowed. She was supported by the captain, distilling drops from his uncurled periwig, so lank and so dank, that he looked like Father Thames without his sedges, embracing Isis, while she cascaded in his urn. Mrs. Jenkins was present also, in a loose bedgown, without either cap or handkerchief, but she seemed to be as little compos mentis as her mistress, and acted so many cross purposes in the course of her attendance, that, between the two, Lismahago had occasion for all his philosophy. As for Liddy, I thought the poor girl would have actually lost her senses. The good woman of the house had shifted her linen, and put her into bed, but she was seized with the idea that her uncle had perished, and in this persuasion made a dismal outcry, nor did she pay the least regard to what I said, when I solemnly assured her he was safe. Mr. Bramble, hearing the noise, and being informed of her apprehension, desired she might be brought into his chamber, and she no sooner received this intimation, than she ran thither half naked, with the wildest expression of eagerness in her countenance. Seeing the squire sitting up in the bed, she sprung forwards, and throwing her arms about his neck, exclaimed in a most pathetic tone, Are you indeed my uncle, my dear uncle? My best friend. My father! Are you really living? Or is it an illusion of my poor brain? Honest Matthew was so much affected, that he could not help shedding tears, while he kissed her forehead, saying, My dear Liddy, I hope I shall live long enough to show how sensible I am of your affection, but your spirits are fluttered, child, you want rest, go to bed and compose yourself." "Well, I will," she replied, "but still, methinks this cannot be real." The coach was full of water, my uncle was under us all, gracious God! You was under water, how did you get out? Tell me that. Or I shall think this is all a deception. In what manner I was brought out, I know as little as you do, my dear, said the squire, and, truly, that is a circumstance of which I want to be informed. I would have given him a detail of the whole adventure, but he would not hear me until I should change my clothes, so that I had only time to tell him that he owed his life to the courage and fidelity of Clinker, and having given him this hint, I conducted my sister to her own chamber. This accident happened about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and in little more than an hour the hurricane was all over, but as the carriage was found to be so much damaged that it could not proceed without considerable repairs, a blacksmith and wheelwright were immediately sent for to the next market town, and we congratulated ourselves upon being housed at an inn, which, though remote from the post road, afforded exceeding good lodging. The women being pretty well composed, and the men all afoot, my uncle sent for his servant, and, in the presence of Lismahago and me, accosted him in these words: "So, Clinker, I find you are resolved I shan't die by water, as you have fished me up from the bottom at your own risk. You are at least entitled to all the money that was in my pocket, and there it is." So saying, he presented him with a purse containing 30 guineas, and a ring nearly of the same value. "God forbid," cried Clinker, "your honour shall excuse me, I am a poor fellow, but I have a heart. Oh, if your honour did but know how I rejoice to see, blessed be his holy name, that made me the humble instrument, but as for the lucre of gain, I renounce it. I have done no more than my duty, no more than I would have done for the most worthless of my fellow creatures, no more than I would have done for Captain Lismahago, or Archie McAlpine, or any sinner upon earth, but for your worship, I would go through fire as well as water." "I do believe it, Humphrey," said the squire, "but as you think it was your duty to save my life at the hazard of your own, I think it is mine to express the sense I have of your extraordinary fidelity and attachment. I insist upon your receiving this small token of my gratitude, but don't imagine that I look upon this as an adequate recompense for the service you have done me. I have determined to settle £30 a year upon you for life, and I desire these gentlemen will bear witness to this my intention, of which I have a memorandum in my pocket-book. Lord, make me thankful for all these mercies," cried Clinker, sobbing. "I have been a poor bankrupt from the beginning. Your honour's goodness found me, when I was naked, when I was sick and forlorn. I understand your honour's looks. I would not give offence, but my heart is very full, and if your worship won't give me leave to speak, I must vent it in prayers to heaven for my benefactor." When he quitted the room, Lismahago said, he should have a much better opinion of his honesty, if he did not whine and cant so abominably, but that he had always observed those weeping and praying fellows were hypocrites at bottom. Mr. Bramble made no reply to this sarcastic remark, proceeding from the lieutenant's resentment of Clinker having, in pure simplicity of heart, ranked him with Mulpine and the sinners of the earth. The landlord, being called to receive some orders about the beds, told the squire that his house was very much at his service, but he was sure he should not have the honour to lodge him and his company. He gave us to understand that his master, who lived hard by, would not suffer us to be at a public house, when there was accommodation for us at his own, and that, if he had not dined abroad in the neighbourhood, he would have undoubtedly come to offer his services at our first arrival. He then launched out in praise of that gentleman, whom he had served as butler, representing him as a perfect miracle of goodness and generosity. He said he was a person of great learning, and allowed to be the best farmer in the country, that he had a lady who was as much beloved as himself, and an only son, a very hopeful young gentleman, just recovered from a dangerous fever, which had like to have proved fatal to the whole family, for, if the son had died, he was sure the parents would not have survived their loss, He had not yet finished the encomium of Mr. Denison, when this gentleman arrived in a post-chaise, and his appearance seemed to justify all that had been said in his favour. He is pretty well advanced in years, but hale, robust, and florid, with an ingenuous countenance, expressive of good sense and humanity. Having condoled with us on the accident which had happened, he said he was come to conduct us to his habitation, where we should be less incommoded than at such a paltry inn, and expressed his hope that the ladies would not be the worse for going thither in his carriage, as the distance was not above 1/4 of a mile. My uncle, having made a proper return to this courteous exhibition, eyed him attentively, and then asked if he had not been at Oxford, a commoner of Queen's College? When Mr. Denison answered, yes, with some marks of surprise, "Look at me then," said our squire, "and let us see if you can recollect the features of an old friend, whom you have not seen these 40 years." The gentleman, taking him by the hand, and gazing at him earnestly, "I protest," cried he, "I do think I recall the idea of Matthew Lloyd of Glamorganshire, who was student of Jesus." "Well remembered, my dear friend, Charles Denison," exclaimed my uncle, pressing him to his breast, "I am that very identical Matthew Lloyd of Glamorgan." Clinker, who had just entered the room with some coals for the fire, no sooner heard these words, than throwing down the scuttle on the toes of Lismahago, he began to caper as if he was mad, crying, "Matthew Lloyd of Glamorgan!" Oh, Providence! Matthew Lloyd of Glamorgan! Then, clasping my uncle's knees, he went on in this manner, "Your worship must forgive me, Matthew Lloyd of Glamorgan! Oh Lord, sir! I can't contain myself! I shall lose my senses." "Nay, thou hast lost them already, I believe," said the squire, peevishly. "Prithee, Clinker, be quiet. What is the matter?" Humphrey, fumbling in his bosom, pulled out an old wooden snuff-box, which he presented in great trepidation to his master, who, opening it immediately, perceived a small cornelian seal, and 2 scraps of paper. At sight of these articles he started, and changed color, and casting his eye upon the inscriptions, "How!" "What? Where," cried he, "is the person here named?" Clinker, knocking his own breast, could hardly pronounce these words. "Here, is Matthew Lloyd, as the certificate shayth. Humphry Clinker was the name of the farrier that took me prentice, and who gave you these tokens," said my uncle hastily. "My poor mother on her deathbed," replied the other. "And who was your mother?" "Dorothy Twyford, and please your honor, heretofore barkeeper at the Angel at Chippenham. And why were not these tokens produced before?" "My mother told me she had wrote to Glamorganshire, at the time of my birth, but had no answer, and that afterwards, when she made inquiry, there was no such person in that county. And so, in consequence of my changing my name and going abroad at that very time, thy poor mother and thou have been left to want and misery. I am really shocked at the consequence of my own folly." Then, laying his hand on Clinker's head, he added, "Stand forth, Matthew Lloyd. You see, gentlemen, how the sins of my youth rise up in judgment against me. Here is my direction written with my own hand, and a seal which I left at the woman's request, and this is a certificate of the child's baptism, signed by the curate of the parish." The company were not a little surprised at this discovery, upon which Mr. Denison facetiously congratulated both the father and the son. For my part, I shook my new-found cousin heartily by the hand, and Lismahago complimented him with the tears in his eyes, for he had been hopping about the room, swearing in broad Scotch, and bellowing with the pain occasioned by the fall of the coal scuttle upon his foot. He had even vowed to drive the soul out of the body of that mad rascal. But, perceiving the unexpected turn which things had taken, he wished him joy of his good fortune, observing that it went very near his heart, as he was like to be a great toe out of pocket by the discovery. Mr. Denison now desired to know for what reason my uncle had changed the name by which he knew him at Oxford, and our squire satisfied him, by answering to this effect, "I took my mother's name, which was Lloyd, as heir to her lands in Glamorganshire, but when I came of age, I sold that property, in order to clear my paternal estate, and resumed my real name, so that I am now Matthew Bramble of Brambleton Hall in Monmouthshire, at your service, and this is my nephew, Jery Melford of Belfield, in the county of Glamorgan." At that instant the ladies entering the room, he presented Mrs. Tabitha as his sister, and Liddy as his niece. The old gentleman saluted them very cordially, and seemed struck with the appearance of my sister, whom he could not help surveying with a mixture of complacency and surprise. "Sister," said my uncle, "there is a poor relation that recommends himself to your good graces. The quondam Humphry Clinker is metamorphosed into Matthew Lloyd, and claims the honor of being your carnal kinsman. In short, the rogue proves to be a crab of my own planting in the days of hot blood and unrestrained libertinism." Clinker had by this time dropped upon one knee, by the side of Mrs. Tabitha, who, eyeing him askance, and flirting her fan with marks of agitation, thought proper, after some conflict, to hold out her hand for him to kiss, saying, with a demure aspect, "Brother, you have been very wicked, but I hope you'll live to see the folly of your ways. I am very sorry to say the young man, whom you have this day acknowledged, has more grace and religion, by the gift of God, than you with all your profane learning, and repeated opportunity. I do think he has got the trick of the eye, and the tip of the nose of my uncle Lloyd of Flydwellan, and as for the long chin, it is the very moral of the governors. Brother, as you have changed his name, pray change his dress also, that livery doth not become any person that hath got our blood in his veins." Liddy seemed much pleased with this acquisition to the family. She took him by the hand, declaring she should always be proud to own her connection with a virtuous young man, who had given so many proofs of his gratitude and affection to her uncle. Mrs. Winifred Jenkins, extremely fluttered between her surprise at this discovery, and the apprehension of losing her sweetheart, exclaimed in a giggling tone, "I wish you joy, Mr. Clinker, Floyd, I would say, hi, hi, hi!" You'll be so proud you won't look at your poor fellow servants. Oh, oh, oh!" Honest Clinker owned he was overjoyed at his good fortune, which was greater than he deserved. "But wherefore should I be proud?" said he, "a poor object conceived in sin, and brought forth in iniquity, nursed in a parish workhouse, and bred in a smithy. Whenever I seem proud, Mrs. Jenkins, I beg of you to put me in mind of the condition I was in, when I first saw you between Chippenham and Marlborough. When this momentous affair was discussed to the satisfaction of all parties concerned, the weather being dry, the ladies declined the carriage, so that we walked all together to Mr. Denison's house, where we found the tea ready prepared by his lady, an amiable matron, who received us with all the benevolence of hospitality. The house is old-fashioned and irregular, but lodgeable and commodious. To the south it has the river in front, at the distance of 100 paces, and on the north, there is a rising ground covered with an agreeable plantation. The greens and walks are kept in the nicest order, and all is rural and romantic. I have not yet seen the young gentleman, who is on a visit to a friend in the neighborhood, from whose house he is not expected till tomorrow. In the meantime, as there is a man going to the next market town with letters for the post, I take this opportunity to send you the history of this day, which has been remarkably full of adventures, and you will own I give you them like a beefsteak at Dolly's, hot and hot, without ceremony and parade, just as they come from the recollection of To Dr. Lewis. Dear Dick, since the last trouble I gave you, I have met with a variety of incidents, some of them of a singular nature, which I reserve as a fund for conversation, but there are others so interesting, that they will not keep in petto till meeting. Know then, it was £1,000 to a sixpence, that you should now be executing my will, instead of perusing my letter. 2 days ago, our coach was overturned in the midst of a rapid river, where my life was saved with the utmost difficulty, by the courage, activity, and presence of mind of my servant Humphry Clinker. But this is not the most surprising circumstance of the adventure. The said Humphry Clinker proves to be Matthew Lloyd, natural son of one Matthew Lloyd of Glamorgan, If you know any such person, you see, Doctor, that, notwithstanding all your philosophy, it is not without some reason that the Welshmen ascribe such energy to the force of blood, but we shall discuss this point on some future occasion. This is not the only discovery which I made in consequence of our disaster. We happened to be wrecked upon a friendly shore. The lord of the manor is no other than Charles Denison, our fellow rake at Oxford. We are now happily housed with that gentleman, who has really attained to that pitch of rural felicity, at which I have been aspiring these 20 years in vain. He is blessed with a consort, whose disposition is suited to his own in all respects, tender, generous, and benevolent. She, moreover, possesses an uncommon share of understanding, fortitude, and discretion, and is admirably qualified to be his companion, confidant, counselor, and coadjutrix. These excellent persons have an only son, about 19 years of age, just such a youth as they could have wished that heaven would bestow to fill up the measure of their enjoyment. In a word, they know no other allay to their happiness, but their apprehension and anxiety about the life and concerns of this beloved object. Our old friend, who had the misfortune to be a second brother, was bred to the law, and even called to the bar, but he did not find himself qualified to shine in that province, and had very little inclination for his profession. He disobliged his father, by marrying for love, without any consideration of fortune, so that he had little or nothing to depend upon for some years but his practice, which afforded him a bare subsistence, and the prospect of an increasing family began to give him disturbance and disquiet. In the meantime, his father dying, was succeeded by his elder brother, a fox hunter and a sot, who neglected his affairs, insulted and oppressed his servants, and in a few years had well nigh ruined the estate, when he was happily carried off by a fever, the immediate consequence of a debauch. Charles, with the approbation of his wife, immediately determined to quit business, and retire into the country, although this resolution was strenuously and zealously opposed by every individual whom he consulted on the subject. Those who had tried the experiment assured him that he could not pretend to breathe in the country for less than the double of what his estate produced, that, in order to be upon the footing of a gentleman, he would be obliged to keep horses, hounds, carriages, with a suitable number of servants, and maintain an elegant table for the entertainment of his neighbors, that farming was a mystery, known only to those who had been bred up to it from the cradle, the success of it depending not only upon skill and industry, but also upon such attention and economy as no gentleman could be supposed to give or practice. Accordingly, every attempt made by gentlemen miscarried, and not a few had been ruined by their prosecution of agriculture. Nay, they affirmed that he would find it cheaper to buy hay and oats for his cattle, and to go to market for poultry, eggs, kitchen herbs, and roots, and every the most inconsiderable article of housekeeping, than to have those articles produced on his own ground. These objections did not deter Mr. Denison, because they were chiefly founded on the supposition that he would be obliged to lead a life of extravagance and dissipation, which he and his consort equally detested, despised, and determined to avoid. The objects he had in view were health of body, peace of mind, and the private satisfaction of domestic quiet, unallayed by actual want, and uninterrupted by the fears of indigence. He was very moderate in his estimate of the necessaries, and even of the comforts of life. He required nothing but wholesome air, pure water, agreeable exercise, plain diet, convenient lodging, and decent apparel. He reflected that if a peasant without education, or any great share of natural sagacity, could maintain a large family, and even become opulent upon a farm, for which he paid an annual rent of £200 or £300 to the landlord, surely he himself might hope for some success from his industry, having no rent to pay, but, on the contrary, £300 or £400 a year to receive. He considered that the earth was an indulgent mother, that yielded her fruits to all her children without distinction. He had studied the theory of agriculture with a degree of eagerness and delight, and he could not conceive there was any mystery in the practice, but what he should be able to disclose by dint of care and application. with respect to household expense, he entered into a minute detail and investigation, by which he perceived the assertions of his friends were altogether erroneous. He found he should save £60 a year in the single article of house rent, and as much more in pocket money and contingencies, that even butcher's meat was 20% cheaper in the country than in London, but that poultry, and almost every other circumstance of housekeeping, might be had for less than one half of what they cost in town. Besides, a considerable saving on the side of dress, in being delivered from the oppressive imposition of ridiculous modes, invented by ignorance, and adopted by folly. As to the danger of vying with the rich in pomp and equipage, it never gave him the least disturbance. He was now turned of 40, and, having lived half that time in the busy scenes of life, was well skilled in the science of mankind. There cannot be in nature a more contemptible figure than that of a man, who, with 500 a year, presumes to rival in expense a neighbor who possesses 5 times that income. His ostentation, far from concealing, serves only to discover his indigence, and render his vanity the more shocking, for it attracts the eyes of censure, and excites the spirit of inquiry. There is not a family in the county nor a servant in his own house, nor a farmer in the parish, but what knows the utmost farthing that his lands produce, and all these behold him with scorn or compassion. I am surprised that these reflections do not occur to persons in this unhappy dilemma, and produce a salutary effect, but the truth is, of all the passions incident to human nature, vanity is that which most effectually perverts the faculties of the understanding, nay, it sometimes becomes so incredibly depraved, as to aspire at infamy, and find pleasure in bearing the stigmas of reproach. I have now given you a sketch of the character and situation of Mr. Denison, when he came down to take possession of this estate, but as the messenger, who carries the letters to the next town, is just setting off, I shall reserve what further I have to say, on this subject, till the next post, when you shall certainly hear from yours always, Matt. Bramble. To Dr. Lewis. Once more, dear Doctor, I resume the pen for your amusement. It was on the morning after our arrival that, walking out with my friend, Mr. Denison, I could not help breaking forth into the warmest expressions of applause at the beauty of the scene, which is really incanting, and I signified, in particular, how much I was pleased with the disposition of some detached groves, that afforded at once shelter and ornament to his habitation. When I took possession of these lands, about 22 years ago, said he, there was not a tree standing within a mile of the house, except those of an old neglected orchard, which produced nothing but leaves and moss. It was in the gloomy month of November, when I arrived, and found the house in such a condition, that it might have been justly styled the Tower of Desolation. The courtyard was covered with nettles and docks, and the garden exhibited such a rank plantation of weeds as I had never seen before. The window shutters were falling in pieces, the sashes broken, and owls and jackdaws had taken possession of the chimneys. The prospect within was still more dreary, all was dark, and damp, and dirty beyond description. The rain penetrated in several parts of the roof. In some apartments the very floors had given way. The hangings were parted from the walls, and shaking in mouldy remnants. The glasses were dropping out of their frames, the family pictures were covered with dust, and all the chairs and tables were meeten and crazy. There was not a bed in the house that could be used, except one old-fashioned machine, with a high gilt tester and fringed curtains of yellow mohair, which had been, for aught I know, 2 centuries in the family. In short, there was no furniture but the utensils of the kitchen, and the cellar afforded nothing but a few empty butts and barrels, that stunk so abominably, that I would not suffer anybody to enter it until I had flashed a considerable quantity of gunpowder to qualify the foul air within. An old cottager and his wife, who were hired to lie in the house, had left it with precipitation, alleging, among other causes of retreat, that they could not sleep for frightful noises, and that my poor brother certainly walked after his death. In a word, the house appeared uninhabitable. The barn, stable, and outhouses were in ruins, all the fences broken down, and the fields lying waste. The farmer who kept the key never dreamed I had any intention to live upon the spot. He rented a farm of £60, and his lease was just expiring. He had formed a scheme of being appointed bailiff to the estate, and of converting the house and the adjacent grounds to his own use. A hint of his intention I received from the curate at my first arrival. I, therefore, did not pay much regard to what he said by way of discouraging me from coming to settle in the country, but I was a little startled when he gave me warning that he should quit the farm at the expiration of his lease, unless I could abate considerably in the rent. At this period I accidentally became acquainted with a person, whose friendship laid the foundation of all my prosperity. In the next market town I chanced to dine at an inn with a Mr. Wilson, who was lately come to settle in the neighborhood. He had been lieutenant of a man of war, but quitted the sea in some disgust, and married the only daughter of Farmer Bland, who lives in this parish, and has acquired a good fortune in the way of husbandry. Wilson is one of the best-natured men I ever knew, brave, frank, obliging, and ingenuous. He liked my conversation, I was charmed with his liberal manner, and acquaintance immediately commenced, and this was soon improved into a friendship without reserve. There are characters which, like similar particles of matter, strongly attract each other. He forthwith introduced me to his father-in-law, Farmer Bland, who was well acquainted with every acre of my estate, of consequence well qualified to advise me on this occasion. Finding I was inclined to embrace a country life, and even to amuse myself with the occupation of farming, he approved of my design. He gave me to understand that all my farms were underlet, that the estate was capable of great improvement, that there was plenty of chalk in the neighborhood, and that my own ground produced excellent marl for manure. With respect to the farm, which was like to fall into my hands, he said he would willingly take it at the present rent, but at the same time owned, that if I would expend £200 in enclosure, it would be worth more than double the sum. Thus encouraged, I began the execution of my scheme without further delay, and plunged into a sea of expense, though I had no fund in reserve, and the whole produce of the estate did not exceed £300 a year. In 1 week, my house was made weather-tight, and thoroughly cleansed from top to bottom. Then it was well ventilated by throwing all the doors and windows open, and making blazing fires of wood in every chimney from the kitchen to the garrets. The floors were repaired, the sashes new glazed, and out of the old furniture of the whole house, I made shift to fit up a parlor and 3 chambers in a plain yet decent manner. The courtyard was cleared of weeds and rubbish, and my friend Wilson charged himself with the dressing of the garden. Bricklayers were set at work upon the barn and stable, and laborers engaged to restore the fences, and begin the work of hedging and ditching, under the direction of Farmer Bland, at whose recommendation I hired a careful hind to lie in the house, and keep constant fires in the apartments. Having taken these measures, I returned to London, where I forthwith sold off my household furniture, and, in 3 weeks from my first visit, brought my wife hither to keep her Christmas. Considering the gloomy season of the year, the dreariness of the place, and the decayed aspect of our habitation, I was afraid that her resolution would sink under the sudden transition from a town life to such a melancholy state of rustication, but I was agreeably disappointed. She found the reality less uncomfortable than the picture I had drawn. By this time indeed, things were mended in appearance, the outhouses had risen out of their ruins, the pigeon house was rebuilt, and replenished by Wilson, who also put my garden in decent order, and provided a good stock of poultry, which made an agreeable figure in my yard, and the house, on the whole, looked like the habitation of human creatures. Farmer Bland spared me a milch cow for my family, and an ordinary saddle horse for my servant to go to market at the next town. I hired a country lad for a footman, the hind's daughter was my housemaid, and my wife had brought a cook-maid from London. Such was my family when I began housekeeping in this place, with £300 in my pocket, raised from the sale of my superfluous furniture. I knew we should find occupation enough through the day to employ our time, but I dreaded the long winter evenings. Yet, for those two we found a remedy. The curate, who was a single man, soon became so naturalized to the family, that he generally lay in the house, and his company was equally agreeable and useful. He was a modest man, a good scholar, and perfectly well qualified to instruct me in such country matters as I wanted to know. Mr. Wilson brought his wife to see us, and she became so fond of Mrs. Denison, that she said she was never so happy as when she enjoyed the benefit of her conversation. She was then a fine buxom country lass, exceedingly docile, and as good-natured as her husband Jack Wilson, so that a friendship ensued among the women, which hath continued to this day. As for Jack, he hath been my constant companion, counsellor, and commissary. I would not for £100 you should leave my house without seeing him. Jack is an universal genius, his talents are really astonishing. He is an excellent carpenter, joiner, and turner, and a cunning artist in iron and brass. He not only superintended my economy, but also presided over my pastimes. He taught me to brew beer, to make cider, perry, mead, usquebaugh, and plague water, to cook several outlandish delicacies, such as les, pepper pots, pilaws, corries, shababs, and staffatas. He understands all manner of games from chess down to chuck farthing, sings a good song, plays upon the violin, and dances a hornpipe with surprising agility. He and I walked, and rode, and hunted, and fished together, without minding the vicissitudes of the weather, and I am persuaded, that in a raw, moist climate, like this of England, continual exercise is as necessary as food to the preservation of the individual. In the course of 22 years, there has not been 1 hour's interruption or abatement in the friendship subsisting between Wilson's family and mine, and, what is a rare instance of good fortune, that friendship is continued to our children. His son and mine are nearly of the same age and the same disposition, they have been bred up together at the same school and college, and love each other with the warmest affection. By Wilson's means, I likewise formed an acquaintance with a sensible physician, who lives in the next market town, and his sister, an agreeable old maiden, passed the Christmas holidays at our house. Meanwhile I began my farming with great eagerness, and that very winter planted these groves that please you so much. As for the neighboring gentry, I had no trouble from that quarter during my first campaign. They were all gone to town before I settled in the country, and by the summer I had taken measures to defend myself from their attacks. When a gay equipage came to my gates, I was never at home. Those who visited me in a modest way, I received, and according to the remarks I made on their characters and conversation, either rejected their advances, or returned their civility. I was in general despised among the fashionable company, as a low fellow, both in breeding and circumstances. Nevertheless, I found a few individuals of moderate fortune, who gladly adopted my style of living, and many others would have acceded to our society, had they not been prevented by the pride, envy, and ambition of their wives and daughters. Those, in times of luxury and dissipation, are the rocks upon which all the small estates in the country are wrecked. I reserved in my own hands some acres of ground adjacent to the house, for making experiments in agriculture, according to the directions of Lyell, Tull, Hart, Duhamel, and others who have written on this subject, and qualified their theory with the practical observations of Farmer Bland, who was my great master in the art of husbandry. In short, I became enamored of a country life, and my success greatly exceeded my expectation. I drained bogs, burned heath, grubbed up furze, and fern, I planted copse and willows where nothing else would grow. I gradually enclosed all my farms, and made such improvements that my estate now yields me clear £1,200 a year. All this time my wife and I have enjoyed uninterrupted health, and a regular flow of spirits, except on a very few occasions, when our cheerfulness was invaded by such accidents as are inseparable from the condition of life. I lost 2 children in their infancy, by the smallpox, so that I have one son only, in whom all our hopes are centered. He went yesterday to visit a friend, with whom he has stayed all night, but he will be here to dinner. I shall this day have the pleasure of presenting him to you and your family, and I flatter myself you will find him not altogether unworthy of our affection. The truth is, either I am blinded by the partiality of a parent, or he is a boy of very amiable character, and yet his conduct has given us unspeakable disquiet. You must know, we had projected a match between him and a gentleman's daughter in the next county, who will in all probability be heiress of a considerable fortune, but, it seems, he had a personal disgust to the alliance. He was then at Cambridge, and tried to gain time on various pretenses, but being pressed in letters by his mother and me to give a definitive answer, he fairly gave his tutor the slip, and disappeared about 8 months ago. Before he took this rash step, he wrote me a letter, explaining his objections to the match, and declaring that he would keep himself concealed until he should understand that his parents would dispense with his contracting an engagement that must make him miserable for life, and he prescribed the form of advertising in a certain newspaper, by which he might be apprised of our sentiments on this subject. You may easily conceive how much we were alarmed and afflicted by this elopement, which he had made without dropping the least hint to his companion Charles Wilson, who belonged to the same college. We resolved to punish him with the appearance of neglect, in hopes that he would return of his own accord, but he maintained his purpose till the young lady chose a partner for herself. Then he produced himself, and made his peace by the mediation of Wilson. Suppose we should unite our families by joining him with your niece, who is one of the most lovely creatures I ever beheld. My wife is already as fond of her as if she were her own child, and I have a presentiment that my son will be captivated by her at first sight. Nothing could be more agreeable to all our family, said I, than such an alliance, but, my dear friend, candor obliges me to tell you, that I am afraid Liddy's heart is not wholly disengaged. There is a cursed obstacle. You mean the young stroller at Gloucester, said he. You are surprised that I should know this circumstance, but you will be more surprised when I tell you that stroller is no other than my son George Denison. That was the character he assumed in his eclipse. I am, indeed, astonished and overjoyed, cried I, and shall be happy beyond expression to see your proposal take effect. He then gave me to understand that the young gentleman, at his emerging from concealment, had disclosed his passion for Miss Melford, the niece of Mr. Bramble, of Monmouthshire. Though Mr. Denison little dreamed that this was his old friend Matthew Lloyd, he nevertheless furnished his son with proper credentials, and he had been at Bath, London, and many other places in quest of us, to make himself and his pretensions known. The bad success of his inquiry had such an effect upon his spirits, that immediately at his return he was seized with a dangerous fever, which overwhelmed his parents with terror and affliction, but he was now happily recovered, though still weak and disconsolate. My nephew joining us in our walk, I informed him of these circumstances, with which he was wonderfully pleased. He declared he would promote the match to the utmost of his power, and that he longed to embrace young Mr. Denison as his friend and brother. Meanwhile, the father went to desire his wife to communicate this discovery gradually to Liddy, that her delicate nerves might not suffer too sudden a shock, and I imparted the particulars to my sister Tabby, who expressed some surprise, not altogether unmixed, I believe, with an emotion of envy, for, though she could have no objection to an alliance at once so honorable and advantageous, she hesitated in giving her consent on pretence of the youth and inexperience of the parties. At length, however, she acquiesced, in consequence of having consulted with Captain Lismahago. Mr. Denison took care to be in the way when his son arrived at the gate, and, without giving him time or opportunity to make any inquiry about the strangers, brought him upstairs to be presented to Mr. Lloyd and his family. The first person he saw when he entered the room was Liddy, who, notwithstanding all her preparation, stood trembling in the utmost confusion. At sight of this object he was fixed motionless to the floor, and, gazing at her with the utmost eagerness of astonishment, exclaimed, "Sacred heaven! What is this?" Wherefore, here his speech failing, He stood straining his eyes. In the most emphatic silence. "George," said his father, "this is my friend Mr. Lloyd." Roused at this intimation, he turned and received my salute, when I said, "Young gentleman, if you had trusted me with your secret at our last meeting, we should have parted upon better terms." Before he could make any answer, Jery came round and stood before him with open arms. At first, he started and changed color, but after a short pause, he rushed into his embrace, and they hugged one another as if they had been intimate friends from their infancy. Then he paid his respects to Mrs. Tabitha, and advancing to Liddy, "Is it possible," cried he, "that my senses do not play me false? That I see Miss Melford under my father's roof, that I am permitted to speak to her without giving offence, and that her relations have honoured me with their countenance and protection?" Liddy blushed, and trembled, and faltered. "To be sure, sir," said she, "it is a very surprising circumstance, a great, a providential. I really know not what I say, but I beg you will think I have said what's agreeable." Mrs. Denison interposing said, "Compose yourselves, my dear children. Your mutual happiness shall be our peculiar care." The son going up to his mother, kissed one hand, my niece bathed the other with her tears, and the good old lady pressed them both in their turns to her breast. The lovers were too much affected to get rid of their embarrassment for one day, but the scene was much enlivened by the arrival of Jack Wilson, who brought, as usual, some game of his own killing. His honest countenance was a good letter of recommendation. I received him like a dear friend after a long separation, and I could not help wondering to see him shake Jery by the hand as an old acquaintance. They had, indeed, been acquainted some days, in consequence of a diverting incident, which I shall explain at meeting. That same night a consultation was held upon the concerns of the lovers, when the match was formally agreed to, and all the marriage articles were settled without the least dispute. My nephew and I promised to make Liddy's fortune £5,000. Mr. Denison declared he would make over one half of his estate immediately to his son, and that his daughter-in-law should be secured in a jointure of 400. Tabby proposed that, considering their youth, they should undergo 1 year at least of probation before the indissoluble knot should be tied, but the young gentleman being very impatient and importunate, and the scheme implying that the young couple should live in the house, under the wings of his parents, we resolved to make them happy without further delay. As the law requires that the parties should be some weeks resident in the parish, we shall stay here till the ceremony is performed. Mr. Lismahago requests that he may take the benefit of the same occasion, so that next Sunday the banns will be published for all 4 together. I doubt I shall not be able to pass my Christmas with you at Brambleton Hall. Indeed, I am so agreeably situated in this place, that I have no desire to shift my quarters, and I foresee that when the day of separation comes, there will be abundance of sorrow on all sides. In the meantime, we must make the most of those blessings which Heaven bestows. Considering how you are tethered by your profession, I cannot hope to see you so far from home, yet the distance does not exceed a summer day's journey, and Charles Denison, who desires to be remembered to you, would be rejoiced to see his old compotator, but as I am now stationary, I expect regular answers to the epistles of yours invariably, Matt.